In the autumn of 1943, deep within the forests of Eastern Europe, a truth emerged that would change everything. The German Wehrmacht had learned to fear many things during their eastern campaigns: the brutal winters, the relentless Soviet counteroffensives, the partisan raids that struck without warning. But they never learned to fear an old blind woman who lived alone in a cottage at the edge of a village they had occupied. They dismissed her as harmless, invisible, irrelevant. That dismissal would prove to be their final mistake. If you're enjoying this story, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us bring more stories like this to life. Anna Kowalska had lived in that cottage for 40 years. Her husband had died in the previous war, the one they said would end all wars. She had raised 3 sons alone, working her fingers to the bone in the village bakery. Her sight had faded gradually over the years, stolen by cataracts that no country doctor could treat. By the time the Germans arrived in their armored vehicles and half-tracks, tearing through the village square with their banners and proclamations, Anna could see only shadows and light, shapes without definition. The soldiers saw an old woman, bent and broken, feeling her way along the walls of her cottage with gnarled hands. They saw someone who posed no threat, someone beneath their notice. They were wrong on every count. The occupation had been brutal from the start. The Germans established their regional command in the old manor house on the hill, the one that had belonged to the Count before the previous war. They requisitioned food, livestock, anything of value. Young men were rounded up for forced labor or simply disappeared into the night. The village priest was hanged in the square for hiding a Jewish family in his cellar. His body was left there for 3 days as a warning. The message was clear: resistance meant death. Most people kept their heads down, trying to survive, trying not to be noticed, but some fought back. The partisan group had formed in the early days of the occupation. They were farmers, teachers, a few former soldiers who had escaped the initial invasion. They lived in the deep forest, moving from camp to camp, striking at supply lines and isolated patrols before melting back into the trees. They were led by a man named Tomasz, a former schoolteacher who had transformed himself into a guerrilla fighter out of necessity and rage. His wife had been killed in the first weeks of occupation, shot for refusing to give up her wedding ring to a drunken sergeant. Tomasz had buried her in the forest and never returned to what remained of his home. The partisans were effective, but they were also desperate. They needed intelligence, supply routes, safe houses. They needed eyes and ears in the occupied villages. They needed someone the Germans would never suspect. Anna had lost her youngest son in the invasion. He had been 22, strong and full of dreams. The other 2 had escaped to the east, or so she hoped. She had heard nothing in 18 months. Every night she prayed they were alive, somewhere beyond the reach of the Wehrmacht. Every morning she woke to the sounds of German voices barking orders, boots on cobblestones, the rumble of military vehicles. She woke to occupation and loss, and she woke to rage. It was a cold rage, patient and calculating. It was the rage of someone who had nothing left to lose. The first contact came on a morning in late October. Anna was drawing water from the well behind her cottage when she heard a voice, barely more than a whisper. A man's voice, young, frightened. He said his name was Jerzy, and that he had been sent by Tomasz. He said they needed her help. They needed someone in the village who could listen, who could move around without drawing suspicion. Someone the Germans would ignore. Anna had listened, her sightless eyes fixed on nothing, her hands steady on the well rope. She had asked only one question. Could she hurt them? The Germans, she meant. Could she cause them real harm? Jerzy had promised that she could. That was all Anna needed to hear. Her blindness became her greatest asset. The Germans saw disability and dismissed her as harmless. They never imagined that a blind woman could be a spy, could be a threat. They never noticed how carefully she listened, how much she remembered. Anna moved through the village as she always had, feeling her way with her walking stick, stopping to rest on the bench in the square, sitting outside her cottage in the afternoon sun. But now she was listening with purpose. She learned the routines of the occupation, which patrols went where, what time the supply trucks arrived, how many soldiers were stationed at the manor house. She counted footsteps, identified voices, noted the rhythms of military life, and every week, in the darkness before dawn, she passed her information to Jerzy or one of the other partisan couriers. The Germans had established a forward observation post about 3 kilometers into the forest, in a clearing beside an old logging road. It was a temporary camp, home to perhaps 30 soldiers who rotated in and out on 2-week assignments. They patrolled the forest approaches, monitored the road, and provided early warning for the regional command. The partisans had been trying to locate this camp for months. They knew it existed from intercepted communications, but the forest was vast, and the Germans moved carefully. They needed exact coordinates. They needed someone who could guide them in. They needed Anna. The opportunity came in mid-November. A young German corporal named Klaus had been billeted in the house next to Anna's cottage. He was 19, far from his home in Bavaria, scared and homesick. He reminded Anna of her dead son, though she would never have admitted it. Klaus had been kind to her in small ways, fetching water when her back was hurting, leaving bread outside her door. He was gentle by nature, unsuited for war, conscripted into a machine that had no use for gentleness. One evening, sitting outside their adjacent cottages in the last light of day, Klaus had talked about his assignment. He was being sent to the forward observation post the next morning. He was nervous about it. The forest frightened him. There had been partisan attacks. Men had disappeared. Anna had listened and remembered every word. She passed the information to Jerzy that night. The partisans had their window of opportunity. A young, inexperienced soldier would be at the post. If they could turn him, use him, they might finally get the location they needed. But Jerzy had a better idea. The Germans trusted Anna. They saw her as part of the landscape, as invisible as the trees. What if she could lead a partisan scout close to the camp? What if she could use her daily routine, her presence in the forest gathering firewood and mushrooms as cover? It was dangerous, perhaps suicidal. But Anna had not hesitated. She would do it. She would be their eyes. The plan was simple in concept, terrifying in execution. Anna would follow Klaus when he left for his assignment. She knew the direction from his description, northeast along the main road, then into the forest at the 3rd-kilometer marker. She would move slowly, as she always did, gathering kindling and mushrooms as she went. The Germans were used to seeing her in the forest edges. They would not question it. Behind her, at a careful distance, would come Piotr, one of Tomasz's best scouts. He would follow Anna's path, using her presence as cover. When Anna got close enough to hear the camp, to smell the cooking fires and latrine pits, she would mark the location by breaking branches in a specific pattern. Then she would retreat. Piotr would observe from hiding, map the camp's layout, identify the best approach for an assault. It was a plan that depended entirely on the Germans' contempt for an old blind woman. The day came with a bitter wind from the east, carrying the promise of early snow. Anna wrapped herself in her heavy shawl, took her walking stick and canvas bag, and set out. Klaus had left an hour before, riding in a supply truck with several other soldiers. Anna moved slowly along the road, tapping her stick, stopping often to rest. To any observer, she was simply an old woman foraging for firewood. No one stopped her. No one questioned her. Behind her, invisible in the tree line, Piotr followed. The forest grew denser as Anna moved away from the village. The sounds changed, less of the occupation, more of wind in the pines and the distant calls of crows. Anna's world was one of sound and smell and texture. She could not see the path, but she could feel it beneath her feet. She could hear the difference between open ground and thick undergrowth. She moved with a confidence that came from a lifetime of blindness, from learning to trust senses that most people ignored. And she listened, always listening. It took her 2 hours to cover 3 kilometers. Her legs ached, her breath came in ragged gasps. She was 73 years old, and her body was failing. But her mind was sharp, and her determination was absolute. She stopped frequently, bending to collect pieces of deadfall, filling her bag slowly. A German patrol passed her once, heading back toward the village. They glanced at her and moved on. She was beneath their notice, invisible in her ordinariness. She heard the camp before she smelled it. The sound of men's voices carrying through the trees, the clank of metal on metal, an engine idling. She stopped, her heart pounding. This was it. This was what they needed. She moved closer, more carefully now, feeling her way around the trees. The smell came next. Wood smoke, cooking meat, unwashed bodies, and latrines. She was perhaps 100 meters from the camp's perimeter. Close enough. She found a stand of young birches and began her signal, breaking branches at shoulder height in the pattern Jerzy had taught her. 3 breaks, close together, 2 meters of space, 3 more breaks. The pattern would be invisible to anyone who did not know to look for it, but Piotr would understand. She had marked the location. Anna turned to retreat, moving slowly back the way she had come. Her heart was still racing. She had done it. She had found the camp. She had given the partisans what they needed, but she was not clear yet. She was still in danger, still in the German-controlled forest. She focused on her breathing, on moving steadily, on not showing fear. She had perhaps 50 meters before the forest would thin enough for safety when she heard the voice. Halt, stop there. The voice was German, young, authoritative. Anna froze. Footsteps approached, 2 men by the sound of it, a patrol from the camp. They had seen her. You there, old woman? What are you doing here? Anna turned slowly, presenting her sightless eyes to them. She held up her bag of kindling, let them see her walking stick. Firewood, she said, in the broken German she had learned during the occupation. For my stove. Winter comes. The soldiers stood before her, young men with rifles. She could not see their faces, but she could hear uncertainty in their silence. They had found an old blind woman gathering firewood. It was not threatening, it was pathetic. "This is too close to the camp," one of them said. "You should not be here." "I did not know," Anna said, her voice shaking with what might have been fear or age or both. "I cannot see. I only follow the sound of the wind in the trees. I meant no harm." There was another silence. She could feel them evaluating her, deciding if she was a threat. The moment stretched. Her hand tightened on her walking stick. If they decided to search the area, if they found Piotr, if they discovered the broken branches and understood their significance, it would all be over. Not just the mission, but the entire partisan network in the region. Everyone she had been in contact with, everyone who had trusted her. "Get out of here," the soldier said finally. "Go back to your village. If we find you near here again, you will be arrested." Anna nodded, mumbled thanks in German, and turned away. She forced herself to move at her normal pace, slow and careful, though every instinct screamed at her to run. She could feel their eyes on her back, watching her retreat. She kept moving, kept her breathing steady, kept her fear hidden. Only when she was back on the main road, when the sounds of the camp had faded completely, did she allow herself a moment of relief. She had done it. She had survived. Piotr found her 20 minutes later at a prearranged spot, a fallen oak a kilometer from the village. He materialized out of the forest like a ghost, touching her shoulder gently so as not to startle her. He had seen everything. He had mapped the camp's position. The information was good. The partisans could plan their assault. The attack came 4 days later, in the hours before dawn when sleep was deepest and vigilance lowest. Tomasz led 30 fighters through the forest, following the path Anna had marked. They came silent and fast, moving like wolves. The German sentries died without raising an alarm. The assault was brutal and efficient. The partisans swept through the camp with gunfire and grenades, overwhelming the garrison before they could organize a defense. It was over in 20 minutes. 27 Germans dead, 3 captured. The partisans lost 2 men. They seized weapons, ammunition, radio equipment, and intelligence documents. Then they melted back into the forest, leaving the camp burning behind them. The German response was savage. They executed 10 villagers in reprisal, chosen at random. They burned houses. They instituted a curfew. They tortured suspects, trying to find out how the partisans had located the camp. But they found nothing. They never suspected Anna. She was questioned briefly, as everyone in the village was questioned. But the Germans saw only what they had always seen. A blind old woman, harmless and irrelevant. They looked at her sightless eyes and dismissed her. They never imagined that those dead eyes concealed a mind sharp as winter frost, a memory that forgot nothing, a determination that could not be broken. Anna continued her work. She listened. She remembered. She passed information to the partisans. Over the following months, she helped the resistance strike again and again. Supply convoys ambushed. Patrols led into traps. Officers assassinated. The Germans never understood how the partisans always seemed to know their movements, their strength, their plans. They never suspected the network of eyes and ears that existed right under their noses, invisible because they had decided these people did not matter. The winter of 1943 was particularly harsh. Snow fell in thick blankets, covering the village and forest in white silence. The cold was merciless, killing the weak and the unprepared. The Germans struggled with their supply lines, their vehicles breaking down in the frozen conditions, their soldiers suffering from frostbite and pneumonia. The partisans, who knew the forest and understood how to survive in these conditions, used the winter as a weapon. They struck harder and more frequently, knowing the Germans could not pursue them effectively through the deep snow. Anna's role became even more critical during these months. She developed a system of listening posts throughout the village, positions where she could sit and seem to rest while actually gathering intelligence. The bench near the village well was perfect because German soldiers often stopped there to water their horses and complain about conditions. The corner near the bakery, where she would sit wrapped in blankets as if seeking warmth from the ovens, allowed her to hear conversations between officers who thought they were speaking privately. The church steps, where she would pause as if catching her breath on her way to prayer, gave her access to the comings and goings at the German headquarters across the square. She learned to recognize individual soldiers by their footsteps, their voices, their habits. Lieutenant Hoffman walked with a slight limp from an old injury and always cleared his throat before speaking. Sergeant Muller had a distinctive laugh, harsh and without humor, that made children hide when they heard it. Captain Reinhardt, the camp commandant, spoke rarely, but when he did, his voice carried absolute authority. Anna cataloged them all, building a mental map of the occupation's human infrastructure. She knew who was important, who was careless with information, who might be vulnerable to manipulation or intimidation. One of her most valuable discoveries came in January, when she overheard 2 soldiers discussing a major supply depot that had been established in a barn 10 kilometers west of the village. The Wehrmacht was stockpiling fuel, ammunition, and food there, preparing for spring operations. The soldiers were complaining about guard duty at the depot, about the cold and boredom, about the distance from the village. They mentioned that the guards changed every 48 hours, that the relief convoy arrived just after dawn, that there were only 8 men stationed there at any given time. Anna memorized every detail and passed it to Jersey that night. The partisan attack on the depot came 2 weeks later. They struck just before the relief convoy arrived, when the guards were tired and expecting to be replaced. The explosion that followed lit up the winter sky for miles. Fuel and ammunition detonated in a series of blasts that could be heard in the village, shaking windows and terrifying the population. The Germans lost months' worth of supplies in a single night. The spring offensive they had been planning never materialized, and they never discovered how the partisans had learned about the depot's location and schedule. But Anna's work carried constant danger, not just from the Germans, but from the nature of resistance itself. Trust was a luxury that could get you killed. Informers existed in every occupied village, people who collaborated with the Germans out of fear or greed or ideology. One wrong word to the wrong person could unravel the entire network. Anna had to be constantly vigilant, always aware of who was listening, always careful about what she said and to whom she said it. In February, that danger became deadly real. A young woman named Maria, who had been acting as a courier between the village and the forest, was arrested by the Gestapo. Someone had betrayed her. Under torture, she revealed names, meeting places, methods. The Germans swept through the village in a wave of arrests. Jersey barely escaped, fleeing into the forest with minutes to spare. 3 other resistance members were captured and executed in the square. Their bodies were left hanging from the church bell tower for a week. Anna knew she might be next. If Maria had given up her name, if the Germans connected her to the resistance, she would be arrested, tortured, killed. She waited in her cottage, preparing herself for the knock on the door that might come at any moment. She burned anything that might be incriminating, though there was little enough. She rehearsed her story, her defense, her denials. She was an old blind woman who knew nothing, saw nothing, heard nothing. She would play the part perfectly because in many ways it was not a part at all. It was what the Germans already believed about her. The knock never came. Somehow, impossibly, Maria had not revealed Anna's involvement. Perhaps she had not known how deeply Anna was connected to the resistance. Perhaps she had died before telling everything she knew. Perhaps she had deliberately protected Anna, taking that secret to her grave. Anna would never know, but she was spared, at least for the moment. She could continue her work. The incident taught her to be even more careful. She changed her methods, varied her routines, became more unpredictable. She recruited others to help, people the Germans would never suspect. The baker's wife, who was deaf and communicated through gestures, became her eyes in the bakery. The village children, who played their games seemingly oblivious to the occupation, carried messages hidden in their toys and pockets. The priest, who replaced the one who had been hanged, used confession as a way to gather information, though he was careful never to break the seal of the confessional. The resistance network adapted and survived. Through it all, Anna maintained her cover perfectly. She was the helpless old woman, dependent on others for basic needs, a figure of pity rather than suspicion. When German soldiers helped her across the icy street, she thanked them with trembling voice. When they brought her firewood out of misguided charity, she blessed them in her broken German. She played the role so well that she sometimes wondered if she was losing herself in it, if the mask was becoming her true face. But then she would remember her son, dead in some unnamed field, and the rage would return, cold and sustaining. The mask was just a tool. Beneath it, she remained herself, unbowed, unbroken, unforgiving. Spring came slowly to the region that year. The snow melted reluctantly, revealing a landscape scarred by war. The forest showed signs of the partisan presence: burned-out vehicle hulks, abandoned campsites, graves marked with simple wooden crosses. The Germans increased their patrols, trying to regain control, but it was a losing battle. The partisan ranks had swollen over the winter, reinforced by escaped prisoners and deserters from other units. They had weapons now, captured from German supply convoys and the occasional foolish patrol that ventured too deep into the forest. They were becoming an army, disciplined and dangerous. Klaus, the young corporal who had been kind to her, had survived the attack. He had been away from the camp on an errand when the partisans struck. He returned to find his comrades dead and his world shattered. He came to Anna's cottage the day after, shaking and crying, seeking comfort from the only person in the village who had shown him any warmth. Anna held him while he wept, murmured sympathetic words in broken German, and felt absolutely nothing. He was the enemy. His kindness to her changed nothing. His youth and fear and homesickness changed nothing. She had lost a son. Thousands had lost sons. Klaus was a cog in a machine of destruction, and she would do whatever was necessary to break that machine. But Klaus's grief proved useful in ways Anna had not anticipated. In his traumatized state, Seeking any kind of human connection, he began to visit her regularly. He would sit outside her cottage in the evening, talking to fill the silence, trying to process the horrors he had witnessed. He talked about his home in Bavaria, about his mother who wrote him letters he could barely bring himself to read. He talked about his friends who had died in the attack, about the fear that gripped him every time he went on patrol, and sometimes, when the words came unbidden, he talked about military matters, troop movements, officer disputes, strategic concerns. Anna listened with the patience of stone. She offered sympathy, made tea from herbs she had gathered, let him believe she understood his pain, and all the while she was extracting information, sorting through his rambling for anything of value. She learned about a planned sweep operation in the southern forest. She learned about supply shortages and declining morale. She learned that the regional command was expecting reinforcements in April, a full company of soldiers to bolster the garrison. Every piece of information, no matter how small, was passed along to the partisans. The reinforcements never arrived. But the partisans, acting on Anna's intelligence, ambushed the convoy on the main road 30 kilometers from the village. It was a massacre. 2 trucks destroyed, 40 soldiers dead, weapons and equipment scattered across the roadside. The Germans retaliated with brutal sweeps through the forest, but they found nothing. The partisans had vanished like smoke, taking their captured supplies with them. The regional command was forced to admit what was becoming increasingly obvious. They were losing control of the territory. As spring turned to summer, the strategic situation deteriorated rapidly for the Wehrmacht. The Eastern Front was collapsing under sustained Soviet offensives. German units were being encircled and destroyed, entire armies ceasing to exist. The occupation forces in Anna's region were increasingly isolated, cut off from reinforcement and resupply. They knew what was coming. They knew the Soviets were advancing, that liberation was only a matter of time. Some began making plans to escape westward. Others prepared to fight to the end, either out of fanaticism or because they feared what would happen to them if they were captured. The Germans became more erratic and dangerous in their desperation. Random executions increased. Houses were searched without cause. The curfew was moved earlier, restricting movement further. They were lashing out, trying to maintain control through terror, but it was useless. The population had passed beyond fear into a kind of numb endurance. They knew the occupation was ending. They could feel it in the changing dynamics of power, in the way German officers argued openly in the streets, in the increasing frequency of partisan attacks that went unpunished. Anna continued to gather intelligence, but now the information she passed along was about withdrawal plans and defensive positions. The partisans were coordinating with the advancing Soviet forces, preparing to assist in the liberation. Anna's role expanded. She helped identify collaborators who might try to escape justice, marked buildings where Germans had stored looted goods, provided details on the defensive arrangements around the Manor House headquarters. She was no longer just gathering intelligence. She was helping to plan the endgame. The final days of occupation were chaotic and violent. Soviet artillery could be heard in the distance, a constant rumble that grew steadily louder. German soldiers prepared defensive positions, mining roads and setting up machine gun nests. Some civilians fled into the forest, afraid of being caught in the crossfire. Others, like Anna, stayed in their homes, waiting for liberation with a mixture of hope and dread. They had lived through so much. They wondered what would come next, whether the price of freedom would be worth what they had paid. Klaus came to see Anna one last time on the morning the Soviets arrived. He was in full combat gear, his rifle slung over his shoulder, his face aged beyond his 20 years. He told her they were preparing to defend the manor house, that the battle would be fierce. He thanked her for her kindness, for listening to him during the dark months of occupation. He said she had reminded him that not everyone in this war was an enemy, that some basic human decency still existed. Then he kissed her hand in the formal German manner and walked away. Anna never saw him again. She heard later that he had been killed in the first hour of fighting, shot by a partisan sniper as he ran between defensive positions. She felt no sorrow at the news, only a distant acknowledgement that the war had claimed another victim. The battle for the village lasted 6 hours. Soviet tanks rolled through the streets, supported by partisan fighters who knew every building and alley. The Germans fought from prepared positions, but they were outnumbered and outgunned. The manor house, their final strong point, was reduced to rubble by artillery fire. By evening it was over. The occupation had ended. The Germans who survived were marched away as prisoners, heading east to fates that most would not survive. The village was free, though freedom looked very much like devastation. The war ground on through winter and into spring. The Eastern Front was collapsing. The Wehrmacht was being pushed back, slowly but inexorably. The partisans grew bolder, their ranks swelling with deserters and escaped prisoners. German control of the region began to fracture. The occupiers became more brutal and more desperate. They knew they were losing. They lashed out with increasing savagery, but it was the rage of a dying beast. The end was coming. Anna lived to see liberation. In the summer of 1944, Soviet forces pushed through the region, driving the Germans westward in a chaotic retreat. The occupation ended as it had begun, with tanks and soldiers and gunfire. But this time, the guns were pointed the other way. The partisans emerged from the forest to fight alongside the advancing Red Army. Thomas was killed in the final battles, shot by a sniper in the ruins of the manor house that had served as German headquarters. He died freeing his homeland, which was perhaps all he had wanted since the day his wife was murdered. When the fighting ended, when the smoke cleared and the Germans were gone, Anna stood in the village square and felt the sun on her face. She could not see the damage, the burned buildings and cratered streets, but she could hear it in the silence. So many voices were missing. So many people were gone. The price of resistance had been terrible. The price of freedom had been paid in blood. The days after liberation were strange and disorienting. Soviet soldiers moved through the village, some friendly and celebratory, others grim and businesslike. The partisans emerged from the forest, blinking in the sunlight, adjusting to life outside the constant threat of death. People embraced in the streets, weeping for joy and grief in equal measure. Lists were compiled of the dead, the missing, the lost. Every family had suffered. Every household mourned someone. The village that celebrated liberation was not the same village that had been occupied. Too much had changed. Too many were gone. Anna received visitors in those first days, people wanting to thank her, to acknowledge what she had done. Partisan fighters came to shake her hand, their faces showing a respect that bordered on reverence. Soviet officers interviewed her about her intelligence work, taking notes for their reports, asking detailed questions about methods and results. She answered simply and directly, providing facts without embellishment. She had done what was necessary, nothing more, nothing less. But the recognition made her uncomfortable. She had not fought for glory or acknowledgement. She had fought because the alternative was unacceptable, because surrender was not in her nature, because her sons deserved to be avenged. The gratitude of strangers meant little to her. What she wanted was impossible: to turn back time, to undo the war, to have her sons alive and whole. Since that was beyond reach, she wanted only to be left alone with her memories and her grief. The new authorities wanted to give her a medal, to recognize her service. Anna refused. She wanted no recognition, no ceremonies, no speeches. What she had done for her son who would never come home, for her people who had suffered, for the simple and absolute necessity of fighting back. She had done it because the alternative was to accept defeat, to bow her head and let evil triumph. That was something she could never do. They tried to insist, sending officials to her cottage with documents and proclamations. She turned them all away. The partition commander himself came, a decorated colonel with rows of medals on his chest, to personally request her presence at a ceremony. Anna had listened politely to his speech about duty and heroism, then told him in her quiet voice that she had no interest in medals or parades. She asked only to be left in peace. The colonel, perhaps understanding something in her tone that others had missed, had nodded and departed. The medal was awarded in absentia, placed in a drawer in some administrative office where it gathered dust and was eventually forgotten. Years later, when historians came to document the partisan war in the region, they found references to an agent known only as the Grandmother. The code name appeared in partisan communications and captured German documents. Intelligence from the Grandmother. Safe passage provided by the Grandmother. The Grandmother reports enemy movements. But her real identity remained unclear, lost in the chaos of war and the passage of time. Many had contributed to the resistance. Many had risked everything. The blind woman in her cottage at the edge of the village was just one of many, and she preferred it that way. Anna Kowalska died in 1958, in her cottage, in her sleep. She was 88 years old. She had outlived the occupation, outlived the war, outlived most of her generation. When they found her, she was lying peacefully in her bed, her hands folded across her chest. On the small table beside her bed was a photograph she could not see. Her 3 sons, young and smiling, taken before the world fell apart. They had all died in the war, all 3 of them, though Anna never knew the details. They were simply gone, lost to the vast machinery of destruction. The village buried her with honors. The old partisans came, those who had survived. They stood beside her grave in the church cemetery and remembered. They remembered how she had listened when others could not, how she had seen what the Germans could not, how an old blind woman had become one of their most valuable agents, hiding in plain sight, dismissed and underestimated until it was far too late. The Germans had looked at Anna Kowalska and seen nothing of importance. They had been wrong. They had been catastrophically wrong, and that mistake had cost them dearly. Her story became local legend, passed down through generations. The blind woman who outwitted the Wehrmacht, the grandmother who led partisans to their targets, the invisible spy who walked among the enemy without fear. The details blurred with time, as details always do, but the essence remained true. In the darkest days of occupation, when resistance seemed futile and hope was a luxury few could afford, one old woman had refused to accept defeat. She had found a way to fight back, using the only weapon she had, her ears, her memory, and her unbreakable will. The Germans had seen her blindness as weakness. She had made it her strength. They had dismissed her as irrelevant. She had made them pay for that dismissal with their lives. The cottage still stands, though it is empty now. Visitors come sometimes, tourists interested in the war, historians researching the partisan movement. They stand outside and look at the simple structure, trying to imagine what happened here, trying to understand how an ordinary place became the site of extraordinary courage. The cottage offers no answers. It is just a building, weathered and worn. But for those who know the story, who understand what Anna Kowalska did in those terrible years, it is something more. It is a reminder that heroism comes in unexpected forms, that strength is not always visible, that the people who seem weakest, who are most easily dismissed and ignored, may be the most dangerous of all. The Germans learned that lesson too late. They looked at Anna and saw an old blind woman. They never saw the steel beneath the frailty. They never saw the danger until it destroyed them. And by then, there was nothing they could do but die.